Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The storm rolled over the Arizona desert like a slow punishment. Wind tore through the canyons, carrying dust and the faint smell of rain. Elias Ward was already inside when it began, sitting at his small table, working a whetstone across his knife. The roof above him groaned, and water leaked in two steady drops into a tin cup by the wall. Elias lived alone on a stretch of forgotten land between Silver Mesa and the dry riverbed of Ash Creek. A former Army scout, he'd been discharged 5 years earlier after a skirmish near the Chiricahua border that left him with a bullet scar under his ribs and a lifetime of memories he didn't talk about. Since then, he had no use for towns or company. He worked his small patch of land, hunted deer when he could, and drank coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. He didn't pray or curse, just endured. That was his mission now, to keep breathing, to keep the ghosts quiet. As thunder cracked close enough to shake the window glass, he heard something faint, 3 slow knocks on the door. He froze. Nobody came this far out unless they had a reason, and most reasons weren't good. His hand went to the rifle propped beside the door, but he didn't raise it yet. When he opened the door, rain swept in sideways. At first, he thought it was just wind, until he saw the figure, a woman standing barefoot in the mud. Her long dark hair was plastered against her face, her thin deerskin dress soaked through. She held a woven blanket close to her chest, trembling from cold but not from weakness. Her eyes, black and alert, met his without a word. She was Apache. He knew it immediately from the stitching on her dress and the turquoise pendant at her throat. For a heartbeat, his body stiffened. Memories from his army days flared up, raids, orders, the confusion of war. But he pushed them down. That was another life. This was just a woman in the storm. "Get inside," he said finally, his voice steady but guarded. She hesitated, as if weighing whether he meant it. Then she stepped over the threshold. The floor creaked under her bare feet. He shut the door behind her, locking out the roar of the wind. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit by the orange flicker of a lantern on the table. She stood near the wall, dripping onto the wood, eyes darting to the rifle, then to the fire. Elias could feel her fear. It wasn't loud or desperate, but it filled the room all the same. He knew that kind of fear, the kind that comes from not knowing whether you found shelter or another kind of danger. He took the kettle off the stove and poured coffee into a tin cup, setting it on the table near her. "It's hot," he said. She didn't move. After a moment, she stepped forward, cupped the mug in both hands, and took a slow sip. Her lips trembled from the heat, but she didn't complain. Elias sat back down, watching her from the corner of his eye. He could tell she hadn't eaten in days. Her face was sharp, her wrists too thin. Still, there was something controlled about her movements, deliberate and quiet, like someone used to surviving alone. He broke a piece of cornbread in half and placed it beside her cup. "You can stay by the fire until the rain stops." She nodded once, but didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. Gratitude wasn't easy when you'd lost everything. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of rain hitting the roof. She dried her hands near the fire, glancing around the small cabin, the single bed, the saddle leaning against the wall, the rifle above the door. Her gaze lingered on the photograph on the shelf. A younger Elias in uniform beside 2 other men, both long dead now. Elias followed her eyes and looked away. He didn't like questions, and he could tell she didn't want to ask any. That was fine with him. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and rough. "You live here alone?" He nodded. "Been that way a while." She studied the firelight flickering on the floor. "Alone is safer," she murmured. He almost smiled, though it wasn't a happy thought. Sometimes. They didn't talk after that. She finished her coffee, sat by the fire, and wrapped herself in the woven blanket. Her breathing slowed. The rain outside softened, turning to a steady whisper. Elias watched her from across the room, his mind caught between suspicion and something he hadn't felt in years, concern. He thought about asking her where she came from, but decided against it. Everyone out here was running from something. The fewer words spoken, the better the night went. He rose quietly, threw another log onto the fire, and turned toward his cot. Before lying down, he glanced back one last time. She had fallen asleep sitting up, head resting against the wall, the blanket drawn tight around her shoulders. Outside, the storm moved east, leaving only the echo of thunder and the smell of wet dust. Inside the cabin, two strangers, one running from her past, the other trying to bury his, shared the same small pocket of warmth in a cold, endless land. Elias didn't know it yet, but that night was the first time in years he'd made space for someone else to exist beside him. The next morning came in pale, dusty light. The storm had passed, leaving the ground outside covered with streaks of mud and broken sagebrush. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing coals. Elias woke to the sound of quiet movement. The woman, already awake, crouched near the hearth, stirring the embers back to life. Her blanket had slipped off her shoulders, and steam rose faintly from her still damp hair. For a moment, Elias didn't speak. He just watched her, trying to understand the reason she had come, or if she planned to leave now that the rain was gone. She moved with practiced calm, careful not to make noise. It struck him that she wasn't acting like someone lost or helpless. She was used to surviving on her own. He sat up, pulling on his boots. "You can use the well behind the barn," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "If you're heading out." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over her shoulder, her dark eyes steady. "Nowhere to go." The words landed heavier than he expected. He nodded once and didn't press further. He went outside, needing air. The sky was washed clean, and the smell of wet earth hung thick. The storm had taken one of his fences down, another thing to fix. He worked in silence, hammering the loose boards back into place. As he worked, his thoughts circled back to her. He tried to tell himself she'd move on soon, that she just needed shelter. But deep down, he knew what the desert did to people alone. It either hardened them or broke them. When he came back, she had made coffee. Not much, but enough for 2 tin cups. The gesture caught him off guard. He sat down opposite her, watching as she poured. The steam rose between them. "You got a name?" he asked finally. She hesitated, as if the answer mattered more than the question. "Naira," she said quietly. He repeated it once, as if testing the sound. "Naira." She looked up at him. "And you?" "Elias Ward." "Ward," she repeated, with the same tone he'd used for her name, slow, deliberate. They drank in silence. The wind had died completely, leaving only the faint rustle of the horses outside. Elias felt an awkward kind of calm settle between them, but it was fragile, like something that might vanish if either of them said too much. He finally asked, "You for the reservation?" Her eyes hardened slightly, not in anger, but in memory. "Was," she said. "Not now." He waited, but she didn't offer more. He could see she'd made peace with silence as a kind of armor. Still, the way she said it told him enough. Someone, somewhere, had pushed her out, and coming here was her last option. She stood, motioned toward the corral. "Your horses," she said, almost a question. "Two," he answered. "They need brushing after that storm." She nodded and walked out before he could stop her. Elias followed her to the barn, more out of habit than distrust. He watched as she approached his mare, the wild one that kicked at everyone but him. The horse pulled back at first, ears flat, but Naira moved slow, steady, whispering under her breath in her native tongue. In a few seconds, the mare relaxed, allowing her hand to run down its neck. Elias had never seen that happen before. "You handle horses," he said. She didn't turn. "My father did." Before, she trailed off. Her voice carried a kind of finality that told him not to ask the rest. Elias nodded quietly. "You can stay here for a while," he said, surprising himself with the words. "There's work, and I can use help with the stock." She faced him then, eyes sharp, searching his face for hidden intent. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough," he replied. "You're hungry, and you can work." Her gaze softened just enough to show she understood it wasn't charity. It was survival. By midday, she had started cleaning the cabin, moving with quiet precision. She folded the blanket she had slept with, swept the floor with a broom made of bound straw, and even boiled the last of the coffee grounds to stretch another pot. Elias repaired the fence, his hammer echoing against the hills. Each worked separately, but for the same purpose: to make the place livable again. That night, they ate stew by lamplight. Neither said much. The sound of the wind through the cracks in the wall was louder than their words. But something had shifted. She no longer stood near the door, as if ready to flee. He no longer avoided looking her way. Before turning in, she spoke once more. "You live far from town," she said. "That's the point," he replied. "People bring trouble. I've had enough of both." She considered this, then gave a slow nod. Maybe peace is not meant for everyone. Her words cut closer than she knew. Elias didn't answer. He looked toward the window, where the moonlight stretched across the dry land, silvering the edges of the old fence line. He thought about how long it had been since anyone had shared his table. As he blew out the lamp, her quiet voice broke the darkness. "Thank you, Elias Ward." He didn't move. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You haven't seen the summer here." She didn't reply, and soon the room filled only with the sound of breathing and the distant cry of coyotes. Lying on his cot, Elias found his thoughts turning restlessly. He didn't trust easily, not after what the frontier had taken from him. But the way she spoke, calm, measured, without pity, reminded him of someone who'd already paid her dues to this land. Maybe she understood the desert as he did. Harsh, unfeeling, but honest. He closed his eyes, trying to rest, though something in him had already changed. For years, the cabin had been silent except for his own voice and the crackle of fire. Now there was another heartbeat under the same roof. It unsettled him, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel wrong. The night stretched long and quiet, and both of them, the scarred soldier and the displaced woman, found a small, fragile sense of safety neither had known in years. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the beginning of it. Morning light poured through the cracks in the cabin shutters, cutting across the worn wooden floor. The air smelled of smoke and dust. Elias was already outside, checking the water troughs and feeding the horses. He moved with slow precision, his mind busy with questions he didn't want to ask. Behind him, the cabin door opened softly. Naira stepped out, her dark hair tied back, her bare feet careful on the cold boards. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "You work before sunrise," she said. Elias didn't look back. "Old habit. Out here, daylight doesn't last long enough." She nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her eyes traced the distant ridge line, where the desert still steamed from last night's dew. "No neighbors?" she asked. "Closest one's 15 miles. He drinks too much and owes me a horse." "So no," Elias said, with a hint of dry humor that caught her by surprise. She almost smiled, but it faded quickly. Inside, she boiled water for coffee. He joined her a few minutes later, boots heavy with mud. As they sat, the silence between them began to shift again. Less guarded, but still full of questions neither knew how to ask. She broke it first. "You were a soldier," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the table. "I saw the photograph." He didn't answer right away. His fingers tightened around the tin cup. "Scout," he corrected finally. "Army pay me to track people, sometimes kill them. Then they stop paying." Her expression didn't change. "You killed Apache?" Elias looked at her now, not defensive, just tired. "Sometimes. Not by choice. Orders." The air thickened. She didn't move or speak, just stared at the fire until it snapped loud enough to make her blink. He expected her to walk out, maybe vanish the way she'd come. Instead, she said, "Then maybe we both did things we wish we hadn't." He studied her face, tried to read the meaning behind her words. There was pain there, yes, but no hatred. It confused him. "You ran from something," he said finally. "What happened?" She hesitated, then spoke slowly, as if testing whether she could still trust her own voice. "My village burned 2 summers ago. Cavalry came. Said it was orders too. I was taken to the reservation. I left when my brother died there. No one stopped me. There was no one left to stop me." Elias looked away. He had no words for that, only the weight of shame pressing behind his ribs. He wanted to say he was sorry, but it sounded too small for what she'd lost. She poured more coffee, her hand steady. "You think I came here because I was lost," she said. "I came because I didn't want to die alone." The word stayed with him the rest of the day. He worked outside longer than usual, mending the fence again, chopping wood until the sweat blurred his vision. The truth was, he understood her better than he wanted to admit. He too had walked away from the world, convinced solitude was safer than trust. Now, her presence forced him to look at the man he'd become. That evening, when the sun dropped behind the canyon, they shared dinner again, beans, bread, and a slice of dried venison. Naira ate slowly, her gaze distant. Elias noticed the scar on her wrist more clearly this time, a thin line of old pain. "You got that from a fire?" he asked. She shook her head. "From a rope." He didn't push further. Some things didn't need explaining. But he remembered the way she had said alone is safer and realized it wasn't fear that drove her. It was exhaustion. Later that night, lightning flickered far off in the mountains, and thunder rolled low across the valley. Naira stood by the door, tense, her breathing shallow. Elias saw it. The stiffness in her shoulders, the way her fingers dug into her blanket. Without a word, he moved to the stove, threw another log in, and sat nearby. He didn't tell her it was nothing, didn't pretend comfort. He just stayed where she could see him. Slowly, her breathing evened out. "Storm won't reach us," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but sometimes it still feels close." He understood exactly what she meant. Some storms never really leave. They just move farther out of sight. She sat across from him, both of them facing the fire. The flicker of the flames showed the hard lines of their faces, worn down by too many nights alone. After a while, she asked, "Why do you stay here?" "There's nothing." He leaned back, eyes on the fire. "Because there's nothing. I tried towns, mining work, army life. Every place had its noise, its people, its rules. Out here, I can breathe." She nodded slowly. "And if I stay?" He looked at her, then, really looked, the firelight catching the reflection in her eyes. "Then we both try to breathe," he said. The words weren't planned. They came out honest, heavy with the understanding of two people who had nothing left to prove to the world. That night, Naira moved her bedroll closer to the hearth. The fire cracked softly between them, casting long shadows across the walls. Elias lay awake, listening to the wind fade outside. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the land was trying to swallow him. He thought of what she'd said about dying alone and realized she had given him something he hadn't expected, a reason to keep the fire burning. Neither of them spoke again, but both knew something had shifted for good. The loneliness that once filled the cabin no longer belonged to just one of them. It was shared now, divided, lighter somehow. And in the stillness of that night, two broken lives began to take shape beside the same dying fire. Not in words, not in promise, but in the quiet act of staying. The next morning, the air was cold enough to see breath. Elias stepped outside to light the stove fire and found frost covering the troughs. The horses huffed in the early light, steam rising from their nostrils. He rubbed one down and glanced toward the cabin. Through the open door, he saw Naira sweeping the floor, her hair loose, her movements quiet but purposeful. In only a few days, she had made the place look lived in, not tidy in a woman's touch kind of way, but practical, as if she understood how to keep a home running where comfort was rare. He realized how quickly she'd learned the rhythm of his days. She rose early, fetched water before he asked, fixed small things that had gone neglected. When she wasn't working, she sat outside near the corral, mending old rope or cleaning saddle straps. He'd seen women like her before during the wars, wives, daughters, survivors. But something about her calm unsettled him. It wasn't obedience, it was endurance. She carried it like armor. Over breakfast, Elias noticed her eyeing the rifle by the door. "You know how to use one?" he asked, half expecting her to ignore him. "I used to hunt with my brother," she said, "before the soldiers came." He nodded, then passed her a piece of bread. "If you're staying here, you'll need to know where the rounds are." She looked at him carefully. "So, I'm staying?" He hesitated. "I didn't say you had to leave." The answer was plain, but his tone wasn't harsh. He didn't want to admit it, even to himself. But her presence had softened the silence that used to hang over every evening. She didn't talk much, but she worked without complaint, and the cabin no longer felt like a place built only for one person to disappear in. That day, they rode out to the small corn patch behind the ridge. The soil was cracked, still damp from the storm, but the seedlings that survived looked weak. Elias knelt beside one, checking the roots. "Too dry under," he said. She crouched beside him, pressing her palm to the ground. "We dig a channel from the stream," she suggested. "It's half a mile out." She met his eyes. "Then we dig half a mile." They worked until their hands blistered. He used the shovel. She followed behind, clearing the rocks and setting stones to guide the water. It was the first time he'd seen her sweat or laugh. A short, quiet laugh when his shovel stuck in clay, and he swore under his breath. It wasn't much, but it broke the wall between them. By late afternoon, they had carved a narrow line from the stream back to the corn rows. When the first trickle of water began to run, she crouched to touch it, her fingers tracing its path. Her face changed, softer, almost relieved. Elias stood behind her, watching. "You've done this before," he said. "My people always followed water," she replied. "Without it, everything dies." He studied her face in the low light, realizing how little he actually knew about her life before. "And what did you do before all that?" he asked. She hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. "I was promised once," she said quietly, "but I didn't marry him. He died before the harvest." Elias looked away. He didn't ask how, he didn't need to. He knew what soldiers and settlers had done to people like her. "You don't have to talk about it," he said. "I already did," she answered, almost a whisper. They walked back at dusk, the desert glowing orange beneath a wide sky. At the cabin, he started a fire while she prepared dinner. When she handed him a bowl of stew, he noticed her wrist again, the rope scar standing out pale against her brown skin. He almost asked who had tied it, but she caught his glance and spoke first. "I took something that wasn't mine," she said. "A horse. They tied me for it. I ran before morning." Elias nodded, setting his bowl down. "Guess we both did things to keep breathing." For the first time, her eyes softened toward him. "You regret yours?" she asked. "Every one," he said simply. "But I keep waking up, so maybe that counts for something." That night, wind rose again, dragging dust against the windows. Naira slept near the hearth, her face calm in the firelight. Elias couldn't rest. He sat at the table, sharpening his knife as always, but his thoughts wouldn't quiet. He remembered the faces of men he'd scouted with, the raids on camps that weren't supposed to happen, the screams in the dark. He had told himself that following orders was duty, but looking at Naira now, curled beside his fire, he couldn't hide behind that anymore. Every scar on her body was a reflection of what he'd helped make possible. Near midnight, she stirred and saw him still awake. "You don't sleep," she said softly. "Used to listening for trouble," he replied. "There's no trouble here." He gave a tired smile. "There always is. It just waits its turn." She stood, walked over, and poured him a cup of water. "Then maybe we stop waiting." He met her gaze, seeing something firm behind it. Not defiance, but strength. "You think that's possible?" he asked. Her eyes didn't waver. "Only if we stop running from ghosts." Elias didn't answer. She set the cup beside him, went back to her blanket, and lay down. He sat there a long time, listening to the fire die down, the sound of her breathing steady and sure. For years he had lived by one rule: keep your distance, trust no one. But tonight, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was fragile, yes, but it felt real, earned through pain neither of them had chosen. As dawn crept over the horizon, Elias finally lay down. The ghosts were still there, but quieter now. For the first time in a long while, he thought maybe he wasn't meant to face them alone. Outside, the first light touched the desert ridge, turning it gold. Inside, the cabin held two people who had stopped running, not out of hope, but because they had nowhere else to go. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start over. The summer heat arrived without warning. By late June, the land had hardened into a sheet of pale dust. The little stream that Naira had helped dig from began to shrink, its trickle fading to a thin line under the rocks. Every day felt longer than the one before. The horses grew restless, the corn wilted, and the air itself seemed to hum with exhaustion. Elias had seen drought before, but this one felt heavier, not just because of the dry air, but because this time he wasn't alone. He and Naira worked from dawn until dark, digging deeper into the trench, patching leaks with stones, hauling buckets from the far edge of the valley. Sweat streaked their faces, and their hands split from the roughness of the tools. Neither complained. It was the first real test of their uneasy partnership. In the early mornings, when the horizon glowed red and the wind carried heat instead of relief, they spoke only to plan the day's work, short, necessary words. Yet the silence between those words said everything, that they were fighting for the same piece of land now, not just surviving beside each other. One afternoon, Elias noticed her pause mid-swing, gripping her side as if in pain. He set down his shovel and walked over. "Sit for a bit," he said. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice was thinner than usual. "You're not," he said. "Sit." She gave him a hard look, then sank onto the dirt. He poured water from his canteen into her hands. She sipped slowly, eyes half closed against the sun. Her face, always calm, showed cracks now, fatigue, hunger, the strain of too many days without rest. He crouched beside her, unsure what to say. Words weren't his skill. He wasn't built for comfort, only endurance. Still, he heard himself speak. "You don't have to prove anything here," he said. "You already pulled more weight than most men would." She looked up, studying him as if deciding whether to believe that. "I don't want your praise," she said simply. "I want this place to live." He nodded. "Then we'll make it live." That night, when they returned to the cabin, both too tired to cook, Naira reached in her satchel and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside were seeds, dried, preserved, marked with careful etching. "These were my mother's," she said. "Corn that grows faster, even in poor soil. I've kept them 2 years." Elias stared at them, speechless. The drought deepened. Dust settled on everything, clothes, dishes, their skin. Elias stopped shaving. His beard turned coarse and gray. Naira's hair grew lighter from the sun, her skin darker, her frame leaner. Despite the struggle, a strange steadiness grew between them. When one faltered, the other stepped in. He taught her to shoot from the porch at dusk, guiding her hands as she steadied the rifle. She taught him to weave ropes strong enough to lift a water barrel without breaking. At night, they ate what they could, dried meat, beans, whatever the land offered. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Naira spoke first. "When you were a scout," she said quietly, "did you ever think about what would happen after?" He looked at her, unsure if she wanted truth or distance. "No," he said, "didn't think there'd be an after." She nodded, eyes on the flames. "Me too." The admission settled between them like something earned. There was no pity, only understanding. For both, survival had been the only plan. Now, for the first time, they were building something beyond that, something fragile but alive. A week later, Elias fell ill from heat stroke while repairing the fence. Naira found him half collapsed near the trough. Panic flashed in her eyes, but she moved fast, dragging him inside, cooling his forehead with wet cloths, forcing him to drink. She stayed up through the night, listening to his shallow breathing. Every time his fever spiked, she whispered in Apache under her breath. Quiet, rhythmic, the same few words again and again. When he woke the next morning, his vision still blurred. He saw her slumped beside the bed, asleep from exhaustion. He didn't move, just watched her, the faint light touching her face. Something inside him settled. She could have left. She hadn't. By the time he recovered, the first sprouts had appeared in the corn patch, thin green blades rising through cracked soil. When Naira saw them, she smiled, the first full smile he'd seen from her. It wasn't joy exactly. It was relief, proof that their effort hadn't been wasted. Elias stood beside her, arms crossed. "Guess your mother's seeds are stronger than mine," he said. "They're stubborn," she replied. "Like you." He almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. That evening, as they sat outside watching the sky turn red behind the ridges, she spoke again, softly. "I used to think the land hated me. Now, I think maybe it just wanted me to stay long enough to listen." He turned to her. "And what's it saying now?" She looked out over the fields, then back at him. "That maybe it doesn't hate you either." He didn't respond, but something in him eased. The quiet between them felt different now. Not empty, but full of something unspoken and real. That night, when the fire burned low, Naira moved her blanket closer to his cot. Neither of them mentioned it. The sound of the desert wind filled the room, carrying dust and silence. Outside, the corn sprouted inch by inch under the dim stars, a slow promise of life returning. And for the first time, Elias Ward didn't dream of war or graves. He dreamed of rain. Rain came 3 weeks later, sudden and violent, as if the sky had been holding its breath for months. The first drops hit the roof hard enough to wake them both. Elias rose from his cot, half disoriented, listening to the roar building outside. Naira stood at the doorway, blanket around her shoulders, watching as the desert turned dark with movement. The dry ground hissed when the water touched it. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Elias stepped beside her and pushed the door open wider. "Let in," he said. They both stood there as the rain washed over the land. The trench they dug, the small field behind the cabin, the cracked earth now glistening black. It wasn't just weather, it was reprieve. Naira stepped into the rain barefoot, her face turned upward. Elias watched her for a while before following, feeling the cold soak through his shirt. For once, the desert didn't feel dead. When it ended, the world smelled of life again. Puddles filled the yard, the horses snorted, and distant thunder rolled low through the canyons. They worked fast the next morning, setting up barrels to catch runoff, checking the small corn patch. The shoots had grown stronger overnight, bright green under the gray sky. Naira crouched, touching one gently. "They'll live," she said with quiet certainty. Elias nodded, then caught himself looking at her longer than he meant to. The rain had softened her expression, less guarded, more human. He turned away, busying himself with the tools. But the feeling stayed, uncomfortable and grounding at the same time. The following days brought calm. The heat broke, the animals grew calm, and for the first time since she arrived, they weren't fighting against the land. The cabin, once cold and silent, now carried the faint smell of cooked beans, smoke, and soap. At night, Elias caught himself waiting for her voice. The small question she sometimes asked before bed, like how far to Silver Mesa, or do you ever miss the noise of town? He always gave short answers, but he listened longer than he admitted. One evening, as the fire burned low, she asked a question that stopped him cold. "When you were in the army," she said, "did you believe what they told you about my people?" Elias stared into the fire. "At the time, yes. They said you were dangerous, that you'd never stop fighting. They told us we were keeping the territory safe." She didn't move, just stared into the flames. "And now," he sighed to sound rough, "now I think we were just afraid of what we didn't understand." Naira's eyes flicked toward him, studying his face. "And you?" she asked. "What are you afraid of now?" He hesitated. "Losing what's left of my peace," he said quietly. "Then maybe peace isn't something you keep," she replied. "Maybe it's something you build." The words lingered long after she fell asleep. He sat there, watching the fire burn out, thinking about how she'd changed the way he looked at this place. For years he had called it a refuge, but maybe it had just been a cage with no lock. The next morning, he found her outside near the horses, brushing the mare that had once refused everyone but him. The animal stood still, patient under her hands. He approached, and for once she didn't step away. "She trusts you," he said. "Maybe she sees herself," she replied softly. "Always ready to run." He smiled faintly. "You thinking of running again?" "Not today." The way she said it carried weight, not a promise, but a truth for that moment, and that was enough. Later that afternoon, they rode out to check the far fence line. The rain had loosened the posts, and one had fallen near the gully. Elias worked the hammer while she held the board steady. The scene felt almost ordinary, two people repairing what the storm had broken. When the job was done, she sat on a rock and wiped sweat from her neck. "You said you buried men," she said suddenly, her voice low. "How many?" He looked up at her, surprised. "Too many," he admitted. "Sometimes I think I buried myself with them." Naira's expression softened. "Then maybe it's time to dig yourself out." He met her gaze. There was no pity in her tone, no softness for its own sake, only the same strength that had kept her alive through things she still hadn't spoken of. In that moment, he saw her not as someone broken, but as someone who had rebuilt herself piece by piece. As they rode back, the sun was setting, turning the wet sand to gold. She rode ahead, her hair whipping in the wind, and for the first time he realized he wasn't watching over her. He was riding beside her. That night, the quiet between them felt heavy but safe. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. They sat near the fire again, side by side this time instead of across from each other. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked softly. "Used to," he said. "Now I don't know where I'd go." She nodded. "Then you stay. Stay long enough to remember what it feels like to live again." He looked at her, her face lit by the flames, her eyes calm and steady. "And you?" he asked. "I'll stay," she said simply, "until I stop needing to." He didn't press her. Both knew the weight behind that promise. She had no family left, no land, nothing but the thin line between survival and surrender. Yet in this cabin, on this unforgiving land, they had managed to carve out something neither had expected: belonging. As the night deepened, the sound of rain returned, softer now, steady and reassuring. Elias leaned back in his chair, watching the drops hit the window. For the first time since the war, he didn't feel like a man waiting for the world to end. He felt grounded, present, alive. When he finally looked toward Naira, she had fallen asleep in the chair, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. He stood, walked over, and pulled it up gently around her. Her breathing was slow and even. He stood there for a long time, listening to the rain and the faint crackle of firewood, realizing that the loneliness that once kept him alive had quietly started to fade. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, he didn't fear it. Outside, the land soaked in the rain it had begged for. Inside, 2 survivors shared a silence that no longer meant distance. It meant peace. And in the heart of the desert, peace was the rarest thing of all. The next morning broke quietly, the kind of stillness that comes after rain. Mist hung low over the valley, softening the outlines of the hills. Elias stepped out of the cabin and breathed in the damp air. The land, for once, didn't feel hostile. It smelled alive: earth, grass, wet wood. For years he had looked at this stretch of desert as something to fight against. Now, with Naira inside, it felt like a place that might finally let him rest. When he turned back, he saw her at the window, brushing her hair, her face reflected faintly in the glass. The image stopped him. There had been women in his life before, short-lived, distant, but none who stayed long enough to make silence feel natural. With Naira, words weren't needed. Presence was enough. Inside, she was making coffee, using the last of their beans. "Town's a half-day's ride," Elias said. "We'll need to go tomorrow for supplies." She nodded. "You trust the people there?" "Not much," he admitted. "But they don't bother me. I keep to myself." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "And me? Will they bother me?" He hesitated. "They might stare. Some talk too much. But you'll be with me." That answer seemed to settle her. It was the first time he'd said "with me" aloud, and he saw the small shift in her expression, a flicker of something between relief and disbelief. The day passed in quiet work. They checked the horses, mended gear, and prepared for the trip. When the sun began to set, painting the ridges in gold, Naira was outside hanging damp clothes near the fire. Elias sat on the porch, carving a small piece of wood. He didn't plan to speak, but the words came anyway. "I used to have a wife," he said quietly. Naira turned slowly. He didn't look at her. "Before the war," he continued. "Her name was Clara. She got sick the winter after I came back. Fever took her before spring. We didn't have children." He paused, the sound of his knife steady against the wood. "After that, I stopped trying to make anything last." Naira didn't move closer, but her voice softened. "And now?" He met her gaze then, his eyes tired but clear. "Now I don't know. You make me forget for a while." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind pushed smoke from the fire between them, carrying the faint smell of cedar. Naira walked toward him, slow, deliberate. She took the carving from his hand and turned it in her fingers. It was a small horse, rough but careful. "You remember her through this?" she asked. "I remember her through the quiet," he said. She placed the carving on the porch rail, looked at him, and said, "The quiet doesn't belong to her anymore." It was the closest either had come to admitting what was growing between them. That night, after dinner, They sat together inside the cabin. The firelight cast their shadows on the wall, long and wavering. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee, though it was bitter and weak. "Tomorrow," he said, "you'll see the town. It's not much. Just dust, traders, and people trying to forget their past." Naira smiled faintly. "Sounds familiar." Before bed, she lingered by the fire, her eyes tracing the worn lines of the cabin. "You built this place alone?" He nodded. "Every board. Took me almost a year. Thought it'd keep me safe from the world." "And does it?" He thought for a moment. "It did. Until you walked in." She gave him a long look, unreadable, then turned to her blanket. "Then maybe it's time to build something else." He didn't answer, but her words stayed with him through the night. The next day, they rode to Silver Mesa. The town hadn't changed much. Weathered buildings, stray dogs, and men who drank from morning till dusk. When Elias dismounted outside the general store, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. It wasn't him they were looking at. It was Naira. She followed him quietly, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, head held high. The storekeeper paused when they entered, his eyes narrowing. Elias met his look head-on. "Supplies," he said. "Coffee, flour, beans, nails." The man nodded stiffly, filling the order without a word. When he handed over the goods, he risked one more glance at Naira. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. There was pride in the way she stood, something Elias hadn't noticed before. On the ride back, he said, "You didn't seem bothered." "I've been looked at worse," she said. "But it helps that you stood beside me." He didn't answer, but she saw the faintest curve of a smile under his beard. By the time they returned home, dusk had fallen. Elias lit the lantern while she put the supplies away. The simple act of her moving around the cabin, knowing where everything went, made him realize how much she had become part of this place. It no longer looked like his alone. After supper, she sat near the fire, sewing a tear in his shirt. "You keep your sorrow locked up," she said quietly. "Why?" He didn't pretend not to understand. "Because once you open it, it never closes again." She nodded, still sewing. "Maybe it's not meant to close. Maybe it's meant to be shared." He looked at her, the needle glinting in her fingers, the light catching the turquoise at her throat. "And you?" he asked. "What do you share with me that you don't say?" She set the shirt down and met his gaze. "That I stopped running the night you opened the door." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, steady, alive. Elias reached across the small table, his hand covering hers. She didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time, saying nothing, the firelight reflecting in both their eyes. Outside, the desert was quiet, and the wind that used to sound like loneliness now carried something else, belonging. When she finally spoke again, her voice was soft but sure. "You asked what I wanted," she said. "I want this to last, however long the land allows it." Elias didn't answer. He just squeezed her hand once, a gesture that said everything he couldn't. That night, they both slept deeper than they had in months. No dreams of war, no memories of fire, just the sound of the wind through the canyons and the slow rhythm of another heartbeat in the same room. Outside, the rain had stopped for good. The earth was alive again, and inside that cabin, 2 souls who had thought they'd lost their purpose had begun to find one together. Summer turned to fall quietly that year. The field that had once been nothing but dust now stood high with yellowing stalks of corn. The air had changed, cooler, calmer, and the smell of the land carried the scent of harvest instead of fear. Elias woke early every morning, same as always, but now there was a second cup waiting beside his coffee pot. Naira had settled into the rhythms of his days so naturally that he couldn't remember what it had been like before she came. The cabin no longer felt like a man's refuge from the world. It felt lived in, shared, balanced. They spent the first weeks of autumn preparing for the colder months. Naira ground cornmeal, while Elias fixed the chimney and stacked firewood along the wall. Their movements had become wordless, like 2 sides of the same thought. She had brought order where he once lived in habit, folded his shirts, mended his boots, cleared the dust from shells he'd stopped seeing years ago. He noticed it all, though he said nothing. The changes were small, but they spoke of permanence. Sometimes she sang quietly while she worked, old Apache songs with no clear melody, only fragments of memory and loss. Elias didn't understand the words, but he liked the sound. It gave the cabin a soul. When she caught him listening, she would stop and give him a look halfway between amusement and embarrassment. He'd only nod and go back to work, pretending not to notice that the silence afterward felt emptier without her voice. One evening, as the sky turned gold over the canyon, Naira came out of the cabin carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Hold out your hand," she said. Inside was a small necklace, silver wire with 5 turquoise stones. The craft was simple but careful, shaped from things she'd gathered over the months. Bits of metal, river stones, polished by hand. Elias turned it in his fingers. "You made this?" She nodded. "You said your wife had one once." He froze, remembering the necklace Clara used to wear, the one he'd buried with her years ago. He looked at Naira, unsure how to respond. "Why 5 stones?" he asked quietly. She met his eyes. "For what hasn't happened yet," she said. He didn't understand at first, not fully. But something in her tone made his chest tighten. She wasn't talking about jewelry. She was talking about the life she wanted, the one she had quietly imagined since the day she stood in his doorway. Elias slipped the necklace into his pocket and said only, "It's fine work." It was all he could manage, but she seemed to understand the weight behind the words. Over the next weeks, they began to visit the nearby settlement more often. Elias traded leather and corn for supplies. Naira sold small woven trinkets and beadwork to the ranchers' wives. Some looked at her with suspicion, others with quiet curiosity, but no one dared say much with Elias beside her. The people learned to call her Elias's woman, and though neither of them ever used that word, it stopped feeling wrong. At night, they sat outside by the fire, watching the stars. Elias spoke more than before, small pieces of his life that he'd buried deep. The war, the years after, the feeling of digging graves in ground too dry to take them. Naira listened without interrupting, her hands resting on her knees, her gaze steady. When he ran out of words, she said, "You carried too many ghosts alone. You should let them rest." "And how do you do that?" he asked. "You stop looking back," she said, "and you make something worth staying for." He thought about that for days. The next morning, he went into town and traded for lumber. When he came back, she found him marking the wall beside the window. "What's that?" she asked. "Room for a cradle," he said simply. The look on her face was brief, but full of meaning, shock, then quiet acceptance. She didn't question him, only smiled slightly and helped measure the boards. They built it together over the next few days, not speaking much, but each movement said what words couldn't. When it was finished, it sat near the window, empty but waiting. The following week, a chill wind swept through the valley. Elias caught a fever and spent 2 days in bed. Naira stayed by him the entire time, cooling his skin, whispering small prayers under her breath. It was the first time she'd seen him so vulnerable. When his fever broke, she didn't leave his side. "I've been alone most of my life," he said weakly. "Didn't think anyone would bother keeping me alive this long." Naira touched his hand gently. "Maybe you were waiting for the right reason." He turned his head toward her. "And you? Why'd you really come here that night?" She hesitated, then said, "Because I thought you might not send me away." He looked at her for a long time, as if seeing her for the first time. "You were right," he said quietly. After that, the cabin changed again, not by choice, but by something unspoken between them. They ate together at the table, not across from each other, but side by side. She began sleeping closer to his cot, eventually moving her blanket onto the same bed without discussion. The transition was quiet, natural like everything else between them. One night, when a wind howled outside and the fire burned low, Elias reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. She rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat in silence, listening to the sound of the rain returning. It wasn't passion or urgency that bound them. It was something steadier, born of days spent in labor, nights spent in quiet survival. The next morning, sunlight filled the room. Naira was already up, kneeling beside the small cradle by the window, smoothing the cloth lining inside it. Elias watched her from the bed, realizing she'd done it every morning for a week now. Not because there was a child yet, but because she believed there would be. He rose, walked to her, and stood beside her in silence. Outside, the field swayed gently in the wind, the corn tall and full. It was the same land he had once cursed, the same life he thought he'd buried, now giving him something to protect. He rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. "You said once you wanted 5 children," he said. She looked up at him, eyes calm but shining. "I still do." He smiled faintly. "Then we better get to work on keeping the roof strong." She laughed softly, the sound quiet but real, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the cabin filled with warmth that had nothing to do with fire. Outside, the sun climbed higher, spreading light across the valley. Inside, Elias and Naira stood beside the cradle. Two people who had come to this land broken, now beginning to build something whole. The past was still there, but it no longer ruled them. The desert had tested them, the storms had tried to break them, and yet they had remained. What started as survival had become a life. The years passed quietly on the Ward homestead, carried by the rhythm of work, rain, and the cries of new life. The cabin that once stood as a lonely refuge now held the sounds of children's laughter and the smell of bread baking in the morning. The walls were lined with small things that told their story. Naira's turquoise beads hanging beside a row of Elias's worn hats, a faded photograph of his old scouting days tucked behind a wooden carving of a horse, and a cradle now long outgrown, resting in the corner as a reminder of how everything began. Their first child, a boy they named Samuel after Elias's father, came the following spring. He was small, quiet, with Naira's dark eyes and Elias's calm stare. 2 years later came Mara, fierce and curious, always chasing the chickens. Then twins, Leah and James, born during a long summer of storms. And finally, the youngest, Elsie, who arrived one cool morning while the rain tapped gently against the window. When Naira had told Elias she wanted 5 children, he'd smiled and thought it was a dream too large for a land like this. But she had been right. Life didn't turn soft because of it. The desert still demanded everything. There were dry seasons when the well nearly emptied, winters when sickness crept through the cabin, and nights when the wind howled so strong it rattled the shutters. But they faced each hardship together, never alone. The quiet bond that had once formed between two broken souls had grown into something unshakable, a family built through patience and endurance, not chance. Elias aged differently than he expected. The lines on his face deepened, but his eyes softened. The warm memories no longer haunted him the way they used to. When they came, they felt like something distant, swallowed by time and work. Sometimes, when he looked at his children playing near the corral, he thought of the men he'd buried long ago and hoped they found peace somewhere, as he finally had here. Naira changed too, though her strength never left her. She carried the same steady calm she had the night she arrived at his door, but now it was joined by a quiet joy. Her laughter, once rare, had become the heartbeat of the house. She taught the children songs from her people, words Elias couldn't pronounce but loved to hear. The neighbors, once cautious, had learned to accept her. When she rode into town, the storekeeper greeted her with respect, not suspicion. People stopped whispering her name behind her back. They started using it kindly. One late afternoon, Elias stood by the fence, watching his sons chase a runaway colt. Naira approached with a basket of laundry under one arm. The years had left faint lines around her eyes, but she was still striking, her hair streaked with silver, her hands rough from work, but sure in everything they did. "They've got your temper," she said, nodding toward the boys. Elias smiled. "Then I'm sorry for you." She laughed, setting down the basket. "You're not sorry." He turned to her, the sun catching the dust in her hair, and for a moment he saw her as he had that first night, standing in the rain, silent, strong, refusing to beg. He remembered the man he was then, how much he tried to keep the world out. Now he couldn't imagine it without her. That evening, after supper, the family gathered outside to watch the sunset. The land stretched wide and golden, the fields swaying gently in the wind. Naira sat on the porch steps, their youngest daughter asleep in her lap. The older children whispered nearby, counting stars as they appeared. Elias sat beside his wife, his arm resting lightly across her shoulders. "Remember when you said you wanted 5 children?" he said quietly. Elias lingered on the porch, looking out at the horizon where the mountains cut dark against the moonlight. The world beyond that line had once been full of pain and war, but here, on this small piece of land, it had given him something different: peace, family, purpose. He rose, stepped inside, and closed the door. The cabin was warm, the sound of his family filling every space. Naira glanced back as he entered, her expression calm and familiar. He bent down, kissed her forehead, and for the first time in years said the words that had waited too long. "Thank you for coming that night." She smiled, her voice low but certain. "You were waiting for me, even if you didn't know it." Elias nodded. "Maybe I was." They stood together in the firelight, the glow casting their shadows side by side on the wooden wall. No longer strangers, no longer lost, but exactly where they were meant to be. Outside, the land lay quiet under the stars, the same land that had once taken everything from them, now giving back more than either had dared to hope. The wind moved softly through the fields, carrying the laughter of children and the steady, contented breath of two people who had finally found home. And on that silent frontier, where storms once ruled and graves once marked the edge of every dream, life had returned, not through luck or mercy, but through the simple act of staying. Elias Ward and Naira had built what the desert itself could not destroy. Their story ended not in loss or parting, but in peace. A man who had forgotten how to live, and a woman who had forgotten how to hope, had given each other both. The wind quieted, the lamp burned low, and the last sound before sleep was Naira's voice, whispering softly to their child, words in a language older than the land itself, carrying the promise that everything they had built would remain. The story had come full circle, and this time, nothing was left unsaid.